Hello, I'm David Penn, Research Analyst with the Finovate Group. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar, GDPR and Online Identity Proofing, an Inconvenient Truth. We're going to be discussing the challenges of GDPR in relation specifically to online identity verification. During our interactive conversation, our speakers will review how GDPR impacts identity verification and the key questions you need to address to ensure compliance, both in the letter and the spirit of the regulation. Allow me to introduce our two speakers for today. We have Gemma Rogers, who is the co-founder of Fintrail, and Robert Prigge, who's Chief Revenue Officer for Jumio. So to start us off, we're going to have Gemma and Robert introduce themselves, and then we'll get underway with the questions. Gemma, let's start with you.
Hi, David. Thanks very much for having me today. I'm Gemma Rogers. As David said, I'm the director of Fintrail. We are a financial crime, risk management, and compliance consultancy aimed at supporting fintechs and regtechs on their exciting journeys.
Excellent. And Robert?
And David, thanks for having me as well. Robert Prigge, CRO for Jumio. We're the world's leading machine learning-powered trusted identity as a service provider. I run sales, marketing, and support out of sunny Palo Alto, California.
Excellent, excellent. Well, let's go ahead and start the scene for the conversation at the top. What is GDPR and why is it happening now?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, David. So GDPR stands for General Data Protection Regulation, and its aims are actually relatively simple. It's aimed at protecting the data and privacy of EU citizens, and what it does is it standardizes the way in which that is done across the European Union. GDPR is valid for any organization that's based in the EU that offers goods or services to EU citizens or is in some way indirectly exposed to EU citizens' data. In terms of kind of why it's happening now, I think we'd all agree that there's more and more personally identifiable information, PII data, that's being used about us every day. And GDPR is therefore a really sensible way of ensuring that this data is used in an appropriate and sustainable manner.
Excellent. So what is the timeline for this, for the implementation of the new policy, and how much time do businesses have before compliance is expected?
Yep, so it's implemented really soon, the 25th of May, 2018. So the regulation was passed a couple of years ago, but it comes into force on the 25th of May, so really not too long to go now, and that is the deadline for compliance, so we will start seeing increased scrutiny from that date.
Interesting. Now here's the trick question. How would you characterize the level of awareness about GDPR among those businesses that you think are most likely to be affected by these new regulations?
Yeah, so what I've seen in the fintech and regtech sector is it's being taken really seriously, and that the preparation is especially good within the European Union. And we obviously have a number of partners in the US who are also taking it incredibly seriously, which is great to see. On a personal level, I've received a lot of emails to check that I'm still comfortable with my data being used in that way, and that I'm still okay to be contacted, which is also good to see. But I hope that, perhaps with some of those firms, perhaps those outside of financial services and firms that are very used to handling lots of personal data, I do hope that preparation is kind of more than skin deep, and that the other areas around data encryption, pseudo-anonymization, and breach procedures, all of which we'll talk about later, are in fact in place. Robert, I don't know if there's anything you'd like to add from your view on the ground to that.
Yeah, well, I mean, when it comes to awareness, I think there's two different types of issues that we see in the marketplace. The first is within the customers themselves. We see overwhelmingly that the marketplace, the customers don't want to be able to say that they're GDPR compliant. They want to be able to prove that they're GDPR compliant, and that they know they've got a lot of confidence in what they've put in place to make sure that they're compliant, not only to the letter of the law, but also to the spirit of the law, which is very important, I think. I think one of the other areas that's worth going over is this isn't just about businesses. As we talk about awareness, there's also a lot of awareness within the government that they're going to be really enforcing this. If you look at the ICO, which is the Information Commissioner's Office, in 2017 alone, they added another 40% to their staff, reaching 200 people, so that there's going to be really teeth and scrutiny around this legislation. And so it's really important that people be compliant, because not only are businesses taking it seriously, but so is the government.
Excellent point. Excellent point. Let's dive a little deeper into some of the issues specifically within GDPR compliance. You've outlined 5 areas of compliance that are critical for businesses to embrace. I thought we could maybe go through each of those next. The first, what does GDPR mandate with regard to data security specifically?
Yeah, so this is absolutely critical. So this is covered in Chapter 4 and Section 2. I can follow up with the specific references if people want after the session. But yeah, data security is absolutely central to GDPR compliance. And GDPR states that if you have data of an individual data subject, a person, you need to hold that data securely at all times. So that means encrypting that data both when it's at rest, but also when it's in transit. And what's really important in GDPR is that these encryption processes are independently tested and verified to make sure that they actually work. Robert, I don't know if you want to then offer a perspective from your side.
Absolutely. And I think for this topic and many others, one of the first places I'd like to start is with a really great quote from Jeremy King, the International Director of the Payment Card Industry Council. And what he said is, how do I achieve GDPR compliance? I start with PCI compliance. And Jumio has for several years been PCI compliant, enforcing all of the different extremely strict, rigorous constraints that you need around data encryption, physical access, et cetera. On this specific topic for data encryption, obviously, it's independently verified as part of the PCI compliance process. We have military-grade encryption and obviously at rest as well as in transit. So it's a super important topic and table stakes for anyone to get into this business, especially around identity, where there's so much sensitive personal information being transmitted.
Certainly. Excuse me. One of the things that's really interesting about the GDPR is just how into the weeds of the process the regulation actually gets. For example, one of the big ideas with the GDPR is that it gives online customers the right not to be subject to decisions that are solely based on automated processing that produces legal effects or other significant effects. One example of this is the role of human review. I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, just to set that piece around the regulation in context, this is covered in Chapter 3. It basically protects customers from being subject to the kind of computer says no decisions that might happen where decision-making is solely based on automated processing. And that can happen, obviously, where there is no element of human review in that decisioning process. So therefore, finding data processors and providers of various services that you might need that really embed an element of human review into their processes is really crucial. Equally, if they do deploy algorithms, that is fine. It is allowable, but they just need to be able to deeply explain those algorithms so that any decision-making process is really transparent to that customer if and when it's required.
Yeah, this right to human review, a lot of which is covered by Article 13, as well as 30-day subject access requests. A lot of these requirements are a great reminder that the spirit of GDPR is an unbelievably pro-consumer law, that they're empowering consumers that when something is decisioned against them, that they're empowered to go find out why and get an explanation. And that's where Jumio is really uniquely positioned in the industry. We believe that we're the only provider that has a complete hybrid architecture that combines artificial intelligence, machine learning, as well as computer vision, while supported with ID experts and a human component, so that you can meet those requirements of being able to explain via a human the rationale behind the decision that was made for that consumer. Again, it's a super pro-consumer thing and extraordinarily difficult, if not impossible, for totally automated solutions to comply with this request.
Sure. Very, very interesting. And while we're talking with you, Robert, let me ask you this question. How does GDPR change the game for identity verification vendors when it comes to machine learning, when it comes to data, that sort of thing?
Yeah, this is one of the most difficult areas, and this is where Jumio is innovating with what we call compliant machine learning. That a lot of the legislation is now machine learning is basically building models, looking at data. Unfortunately, now with GDPR, it's very, very difficult to be mixing those data across customers, across different use cases, et cetera. And so you need to build a really sophisticated architecture in order to build a compliant machine learning program that allows you to build models for specific customers that you can improve your product without mixing data from different areas and to be in compliance with the letter as well as the spirit of the law. This is another area where we've excelled by having restricted PII access and our unique ability to come up with machine learning algorithms that are targeted with GDPR in mind. A lot of vendors in this space and in even similar spaces haven't really thought that far ahead in GDPR. And so we feel that we're ahead of the game in our ability to not only be ourselves GDPR compliant, but to enable our customers to be GDPR compliant themselves.
Sure. Speaking also about data, we talked about how the idea data retention is also something that's regulated by GDPR. I know Jim mentioned that earlier. What are some of the mandates that exist here around the area of data retention?
Yeah, so again, another really critical area covered in Clause 39. I think before we dive into that, it might just be worth spending a bit of time talking about the difference between a controller and a processor of data. Sure. And a controller is somebody who decides what they're going to do with each individual piece of data and how that's going to be processed. And then a processor is someone who offers a service that utilizes the data of the controller. Now, both are covered by GDPR, which is what's kind of really interesting about this particular piece of regulation. And it kind of really underscores the fact that there's a kind of symbiotic relationship between data controllers in maintaining and achieving GDPR compliance and working with their processors to do so. So I think on data retention, just to take it back to that, the GDPR stipulates that both controllers and their processors only process the minimum amount of information required for their purposes, and that this data is held for a minimum period. So as Robert was saying earlier, this is a really consumer-centric piece of regulation that puts data privacy of the individual at the heart of everything, and that's what this clause is designed to do. On the other hand, again, as Robert mentioned a bit earlier, we do, controllers and processors do need to be able to comply with these things called subject access requests, which is when an individual asks a firm for all the data that is held on them. These requests, they're very important. People need to know what data is held on them, and they have that right to ask. And the requests have to be responded to within 30 days. So processors and controllers need to work together to make sure that they can comply with this time limit. Another element here that you've got is the right to be forgotten. So this is, again, where consumers are able to get their hands on all the data that controllers and processors have on them, and that can be deleted. So again, in these circumstances, it's really important that processors and controllers can work together to ensure that those requests are complied with.
In the case of Jumio, the data retention is one of those other areas where we provide a lot of flexibility to our customers. In general, they're in the driver's seat and they can decide whether they want to store the data by themselves or whether they want to leverage one of our PCI certified data centers. There's two areas that we touched on a little bit with Gemma. There's one which is customization and being a configurable data retention policies. That's something that we've had a very long time. All of our customers are able to decide how long do they want to store data, what do they want to do with it, where do they want to store it. Per the new legislation, you have the ability to correct data that's inaccurate within the database. And when you delete things, as Gemma mentioned, there is this right to be forgotten. But as part of that, the data needs to be securely deleted, and it's not just simply deleting the ones and zeros. You need to have demonstrated procedures, policies, and rigor in place to show that that's being done correctly. And again, we're helped here because all of those things are requirements of PCI compliance. So for us, being able to meet the GDPR requirements is unbelievably simple for us.
Yeah, excellent, excellent. I want to remind our audience, before we start entertaining some of the questions and the polls and so forth, that it's an interactive webinar today, so please feel free. I know a number of you already participated in the poll questions that we provided throughout the webinar. I believe that we're pushing another poll question here in just a minute. So in addition to going ahead and adding your responses to those poll questions, feel free to ask us any questions that you might have, either about something that Gemma or Robert have already covered, or if there's a question about GDPR particularly that we haven't covered, a particular challenge that you might be experiencing with your organization, or just a general question about the regulation, the rollout, or even looking beyond that. Please feel free to go ahead and to use the platform to ask your questions. We're going to be getting to those in just a minute after we touch on just a few more things with Gemma and Robert, and then take a quick look at the poll questions to try to get a survey of the field. So definitely feel free to send in your questions as well. We're going to save some time at the end of the webinar so that you can have those questions asked. And if they're just general questions, that's fine. If you have a specific question for Gemma or for Robert, that's fine as well. Go ahead and indicate in your question if it's specifically for one of our speakers. That way we can make sure that it gets their immediate attention. But before we get into that, I did have one more question I wanted to ask about sort of the pro-security, so to speak, features of the GDPR, and that has to do with breach notification. And I wondered if maybe we could talk just a little bit about what this aspect of the regulation requires of data processors.
Yeah, sure. Another great question. So in the GDPR requirement around breach notification, which is in Chapter 4, Section 2, it basically requires processors to notify their controllers without undue delay once they become aware of any form of data breach. And this is so that then the controllers can obviously comply with their own requirement to notify their customers if they've been affected by that data breach. So it's really important that processors have a number of different things in place. So the main one is having some very clear policies and procedures around breach notifications, and making sure that staff really understand that and are well trained on it. And not only that they've been well trained on it, but that the process has been tested and role played out in some way, shape or form, such that employees can get a real live sense of what it's like to deal with potential data breach. Now, what you also want to make sure is that those processes and maybe even those role play scenarios have been put through their paces by an independent tester. So that could be a third party that specializes in assuring exactly those kind of processes, or it could even be that process has been validated by a local regulatory agency to make sure it's really up to scratch. So I'd say those were the kind of really key points for processors to be aware of around breach notification.
Yeah, especially the requirement that the notifications occur in the first 72 hours is really strict, and that's where, as you say, you need to make sure that you've got those policies and procedures in place. People have executed it. You've had third parties look at it. Breaches are an unwelcome thing that's increasingly common in the world, and as part of this legislation, they want to make sure that people are ready for it, because it's bad enough when you have it, but then to not have policies in place of notifying people and how you deal with it is unforgivable. And so I think it's a very welcome thing as we read newspapers every day and there's a new breach. Often we're hearing about it from the newspaper, not necessarily from the companies. It's very good that the legislators have jumped ahead and enforced these requirements to make sure that other companies like Jumio can react in a timely manner with notifications should something occur.
That's an excellent point that you make about how often we hear them from the newspaper relative to the company where the actual breach occurs. It seems often these days when these things happen, the simple fact that we hear that the company is on the problem, I think people have started to accept the notion that these sorts of things are going to happen from time to time, as you mentioned. But the idea that they're on it, that they're communicating with you, that they understand it, that they're sort of on your side and not trying to stand off to the side when these things happen is really, I think, helped make the difference, certainly at least in the PR side of things, between those companies who are believed to have handled breaches well and those who, it seems like, are getting just repeatedly vilified for the way that they didn't handle a particular breach. Speaking of this particular end of it, and the point that you made earlier about the readiness of the government to make sure that compliance is taking place, when compliance does not happen, how are the penalties and fines, how do those take place? What happens there?
Yeah, so interesting question. And I think what's really important to note around GDPR is that it does impose quite stiff fines on data controllers and again on processors for non-compliance, and these are probably some of the toughest fines that we've seen in this space ever. So definitely something to be taken seriously, and definitely something for firms to be thinking about very carefully. And it's kind of one of the reasons that I think firms are really quite anxious about this, and the preparedness has been quite good, certainly in the EU and with firms that we've been working with. So the way that fines tend to be structured is that you've got kind of lower fines and upper fines. The lower fines can go up to sort of 10 million euros or 2% of the worldwide annual revenue of the prior financial year. So really quite significant, even at that lower end. You're going to get lower fines related to poor record keeping, poor levels of cooperation, even with something like the ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office, when they ask for additional details. Potentially could see lower fines where you've got kind of data security lapses, but nothing sort of terribly serious that causes lots of breaches, but where the controls are still not strong enough. And where you've got kind of poor notification around breaches or poor impact assessments around data protection or data breaches themselves. So those are the kinds of areas you'd see the lower fines, and as I say, they're up to 10 million euros or 2% of the worldwide annual revenue of the prior financial year. Now, because there are some lower fines, there are, of course, some upper fines, and those can go up to 20 million euros or 4% of the worldwide annual revenue of the prior financial year. And it's whichever is higher of those two. So a real push to put a heavy financial penalty on non-compliance. Where you'll start to see upper fines is around infringements of the basic principle for processing, infringement of data subject rights, and infringements related to the transfer of data to third countries or international organisations that is restricted under the regulation or has not been properly communicated to your customers. So that's kind of how the fines are working, and I think Robert mentioned it earlier in the call in the webinar was that the Information Commissioner's Office has increased its team by 40%. So I think this is just another sign of how seriously this regulation is being taken, particularly in the UK, but also across the wider European Union.
Absolutely. And with that in mind, I thought it might be a good opportunity to revisit, sort of now we know the lay of the land, some of the interactive responses that we've gotten from the folks who've been listening. I know that we've had folks responding to the 3 poll questions that we presented over the course of the webinar, and the Q&A is starting to populate up just a little bit. So let's go ahead and take a look at the results for the first poll question. And just as a reminder, that question was, do you feel confident your company will be fully compliant with GDPR by the 25th of May deadline? And taking a quick look at the poll, Well, good news. Good news. We've got more than 68% of our respondents suggesting that they will be on time, and 30% saying that they are unsure. My first question is, how do those numbers sound to you in terms of your own experience working with companies? That sort of 2/3 say that they're ready to go, and another third not so sure.
Yeah, for me personally, I'd bet heavily on slightly delayed and not being 0% on May 24th. Basically in the marketplace, this is something that all of our customers are working on, almost like a Y2K problem that is taking up a significant amount of bandwidth for many aspects of their business. I do definitely think that people are aware of it and ahead of it, and yet the implications are so vast. I think as people are really getting into it and seeing all of the different implications, they're seeing that it's even broader than they anticipated. Instead of just the commercial aspects, which we focused on predominantly today, there's also HR implications. There's implications in the way that you do marketing, in email campaigns, and et cetera. And so, I think that's why we've been successful with a lot of companies by accelerating their GDPR compliance and making sure that they know their identity verification component of their business is already GDPR compliant, so that they can focus on the myriad other things they need to get done.
Excellent. Gemma, in your experience?
Yeah, so in my experience, I think I'd agree with what Robert said there about the 0% being slightly delayed, and that's unlikely to be the case on the 24th of May. I wonder if potentially, depending on who's in our audience, perhaps the unsure numbers there suggest that the firms that they're involved with perhaps could do a little bit more around communicating GDPR and how it affects them and their roles, and that perhaps that training is something that could be improved a little bit in those firms, just so that all employees are really fully aware of what's going on in this space. So hopefully this webinar is a good place to start, but I wonder if that's maybe what some of the figures are telling us.
Oh, excellent. And perhaps those who are in that 30%, 31% unsure bracket will be among those asking a few questions in the Q&A that we'll get to in just a moment. And maybe we can dive a little deeper into some of that uncertainty for them. Let's go ahead and take a look at our second poll question. Again, we asked 3 questions during the webinar for our listeners to respond to and sort of interact with our speakers. Our second poll question was this: when working with an identity provider, what is your biggest fear when it comes to GDPR? And some of the ideas were data storage, encryption, and breach notification. And as we take a look at the response, both data storage and breach notification were about the same at about 43%. Encryption fairly low on the list of concerns. I'd like to ask again, does that measure up with your experience in the field?
Yeah,
so
me, go ahead, Gemma.
Sorry?
Oh, all right. Thanks, Robert. See, for me, these results are actually a little bit surprising to me. I probably have seen a little bit more focus on encryption in some of the companies that we've been working with. But that said, I do think, particularly in some of the more technologically minded firms that are out there now that are developing as part of the fintech and regtech community, encryption and the way in which data is held and transmitted is just a much more intrinsic part of the way that they work, rather than perhaps some of the firms that have been established for a long time and for whom this amount of data being stored digitally is still a relative challenge. But yeah, I actually probably would have expected a little bit more of an even spread across the 3 results, but interesting to see them pan out like this.
Yeah. Robert, what do you think?
Yeah, I have probably a similar reaction that encryption, I think, can mean a couple things. Obviously there's the encryption that happens in transit and at rest, but it also goes to issues of how do you handle PII data, and I think a lot of people are naive about, a vendor supports encryption because one piece of the chain is encrypted. It actually needs to have everything be encrypted everywhere. And I think what happens is the piece that they interface with might be encrypted, and yet they kind of forget that that's only one stop on the train ride, that there's many, many, many other stops of where that data goes, where it also needs to be encrypted, and that's where most vendors have no proof and don't have the technology in place that they're doing that correctly. This probably, to me, indicates a little bit of overconfidence in that area.
Sure. And I have to admit, one of the things that I'm really starting to pick up and understand through the conversation is just how GDPR is one of those things where people sometimes feel like they've got a handle on it, and without really diving deep into that, without really working with some partners who understand the totality of the regulation, it seems like it's the kind of thing where you think you've cleaned up the house and you open up the door and there's a whole suite of rooms that really haven't even been addressed. And I really appreciate the fact that we're sort of going through all of these elements sort of one by one, just to really sort of tease out for folks some of the areas that they might not have thought about. You mentioned the breadth of encryption, for example, that are still critically important in ensuring, again, as you mentioned at the beginning, the letter and the spirit of the GDPR. Again, I just wanted to remind everyone that we will be taking some questions momentarily, so if you've got any questions either about something that Jim or Robert has said, some clarification, or a general question, something you've heard someone else say about GDPR that you'd like to ask to an expert to get some deeper understanding, please feel free to go ahead and ask your questions on the platform. We'll get to those again in just a moment. I did want to, before we finish this section, go to one more poll question that we had. Again, we asked 3 of them, and we had one more poll question I wanted to touch on before we did get to the Q&A. And that question is, among the subjects discussed today, which are the ones you'd like to know more about? And some of the options were compliant machine learning, GDPR compliance overall, and compliant digital identity. And taking a look at our poll, fairly evenly distributed, I suppose. Compliant digital identity coming out ahead of the pack with about 45, 46% of the respondents, followed by GDPR compliance overall, and then maybe about a quarter, a little less folks interested in the issue of compliant machine learning. Is that something that, again, and we'll go with you, Robert, to start, that is in sync with what your observations are?
I think one of my key takeaways from this and this conversation is almost everything that people are working on, they now need to put the word compliant in front of it. That you now need to be worried about compliant machine learning and compliant identity and compliant storage and compliant deletion. And it's really that depth and breadth that is so complicated for our customers to implement, that's really where people need to be thinking that this is not a very shallow kind of change to the organization. This is something that's going to have a profound impact, and almost anything in the workflow, you're going to need to add the word compliant to the beginning of it. The fact that compliant digital identity is the leader isn't horribly surprising. When there's so much personal identity information attached to the identity, and you're so restricted in the way that you transmit that data internally as well as externally. That's why we made the choice to be PCI compliant several years ago in order to be as strict as humanly possible. But most companies are not in that position. And so I think everyone's going to need to rethink everything they do with compliant first and foremost.
Excellent. Jimmy, your thoughts? Compliance, sort of like nowadays, every company needs to put blockchain in front of their pizza shop to make money. Is compliance the new blockchain in that respect?
Yeah, maybe. I'd be very excited if that were the case. But yeah, I think in terms of kind of echoing some of Robert's thoughts there, the fact that compliant digital identity has come out on top, to me, that's a real reflection of the strides that have been made in the industry around being able to provide this notion of digital identity. I think it's been a really exciting and highly improved customer experience, and that's, I think, perhaps the results of this reflect just how important a part of our lives, both as consumers, digital identity has become, but also probably as firms, as we're thinking about how we can really improve the experience for our customers by using things like digital identity in our onboarding flows and things like that. So I think it's possibly reflective of, yes, absolutely, the depth of what compliant digital identity actually means in reality, but also just how important digital identity has become to us as society.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Excellent, excellent. I think we were getting some questions here, and I want to go ahead and make sure that we get a chance to respond to some of them. Some of them touch on some of the things that you've both discussed, and some of them maybe open up a few new areas, or at least more specific areas. So let me take a look at one of the questions here that's been bumped up by our audience, and this has to do with smaller FIs. This question reads: for a small community bank or credit union based in the U.S. that has customers or two living part or full-time in Europe, what are the implications of GDPR and how should they approach it? So talking again, I guess, about smaller domestic FIs that are doing business in Europe and what their approach to GDPR needs to be. And whichever Gemma or Robert would like to take this first one would be fine.
Happy to take this one at a very high level, and obviously without knowing everything about that particular business model. I suggest if you're dealing in any way with customers who reside in the European Union and or who are European citizens, then GDPR definitely does apply. So I think a great place to start often when you're thinking about GDPR compliance is working out what kind of data do you have about those individuals, and then checking why you need to process that data and why you need to store and hold that data before you then get into thinking about exactly how all of that data is encrypted and transmitted and all of those things. I think figuring out what forms of data you hold is a great start point. The Information Commissioner's Office has a load of great guidance on it around how to do these kind of exercises, and there are 6 kind of key principles or lawful bases for processing data, and these relate to consent. So perhaps you've already got the consent of the individual to manage and process their data, in which case that's great. You might have a contract already in place with them that says, I need your data for these exact reasons, and in order to provide you with the service that I provide you with, I need to collect your data. Please sign here that you agree. Great. You may also have a legal obligation to collect that data, so you might be complying with another piece of regulation in addition to GDPR by collecting certain bits of information. There may be vital interest. This is kind of around saving a life, so it's probably more important for kind of law enforcement, or it might be a public task, so something that's in the public interest. And then you also have this category of legitimate interest, where it is legitimate for you to have information about, if you're a bank, to have information about your customers' transactions, for example. So I think those, doing a bit of a data audit and then thinking about what are those lawful bases for processing that data, and then sort of getting into, okay, how do I now sort of work out how I'm encrypting and holding all of that data? I think that's probably a logical place to start.
Certainly, that makes a great deal of sense. We're getting quite a few questions pouring in. Here's one question, actually directed for you, Robert, and it says, let's see, can you explain a little more about compliant machine learning? What is that, and how is it different from traditional machine learning? And I think that was for you, Robert?
Yeah, absolutely. So, specifically within identity verification vendors, almost everyone aggregates data across multiple customers in order to develop their algorithms. Unfortunately, with GDPR, vendors can only develop specific AI models that's trained on the data of a given customer, and you can't leverage the data between other customers in order to create a more complex model. And so because the Jumio approach has been working on this for a very long time with data privacy and security in mind from the very beginning, we have machine learning workflows that include the initial data capture, the pre-processing, tagging, as well as algorithm training and model development. And so because we architected from step one a compliant machine learning model, we are able to be the vanguard in this area and apply machine learning across the 120 million transactions that we've done to date because we've understood this concept and kind of architected everything that we're doing with it in mind.
Excellent, excellent. I appreciate that question. That's very, very clarifying as we mentioned the idea of all of these things having to be compliant, just exactly what we mean when we say compliant. Let's go ahead and take a look at another question that just came in. And let's see, in the case of retention, how do you manage the difference between GDPR and European regulations for retention and the Americans and privacy shield? I believe they mean data retention. And I think this is a question for Gemma, I believe.
Yeah, so this is interesting where you get kind of 3 or 4 different pieces of legislation that potentially intersect, and it might feel like they contradict, but in many cases, all GDPR is asking you to do is hold data for a minimum period. And now if that minimum period is already stipulated within another piece of regulation that you need to hold on to data for 6 years in case there's any form of complaint or something from a customer, then you hold that data for 6 years and you're completely sort of compliant then with GDPR. So I think it's really just about taking that kind of common sense approach of saying, okay, well, are we clear on why we're holding this data for this period of time, and that tracks back to a specific piece of regulation? And if it does, and that's still valid, then you'll be GDPR compliant, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and this is where it gets pretty sophisticated with the different legislation in the U.S., EMEA, Asia, et cetera. At Jumio, we work closely with our customers to determine what they want to do with the data, where they want to store it, for how long. All of it's customizable, based on different regions, use cases, et cetera. But this really is a great question from Andreas in the webinar here. And there's no super easy answer. It's really increasingly complicated dealing with all of these different laws that are in play simultaneously.
Sure, sure. Well, we don't have a great deal of time left, and we do have a number of really good questions. But I think here's one question I think is probably one that's both generally helpful and sort of sums up the conversation, or at least will give you an opportunity maybe to sum up the conversation just a bit. And here's the question. Let's see. Let me get to it here right a second ago. This has to do with working with third-party vendors. And in terms of GDPR, what are the vital elements that should be considered when you're evaluating and working with a third-party provider? And again, maybe we start with Gemma and go from there.
Yeah, sure. Great question. Look, I think there are 5 key ingredients that you're looking at when assessing a potential vendor for their GDPR compliance. The first one that you want to think about is data encryption. What are they doing with that data that you provide them with? How is it being transmitted to them? Is it encrypted? Is it secure? And is it, does it have the ability to be securely deleted as well as being securely stored? There's this notion of human review that we talked about. So can you make sure that the processes or the decisions rather that your customers are subject to are not based solely on automated processing, that they have maybe this hybrid approach that Robert talked about, which is really exciting, or if there are solely automated processes, that those algorithms are really clearly understood and can be unpicked, particularly by non-experts as well, so that they're understandable to the customer in the face of any subject access request. You've got this notion of compliant machine learning, which Robert's talked about an awful lot, but is going to become more and more important as time goes on and more people start employing machine learning, because it's a very exciting method of data analysis. You then want to make sure those data retention policies are customizable within your processor, that they understand the different requirements that different companies in different territories might have, and that they can comply with those requirements. And then finally, you've got those breach notification procedures. Have those been tested? Are they in place? Do people in the firm really understand them? Have they got them kind of ingrained in their minds? And for us, those are the 5 key ingredients that really help you assess whether or not a data vendor or a vendor is suitable for your needs.
And obviously, for Jumio, we're uniquely positioned to be able to meet all 5 of those requirements. At an even higher level, I think what I'd say is when you're looking at GDPR and vendors in general, it's important that they not say they're GDPR compliant, but they be able to prove it. This is why we've been PCI compliant. To my knowledge, we're the only digital identity vendor that's PCI compliant, because it is so strict, so onerous, that I would say, separate fact from fiction, understand who really knows what they're talking about, and who's thought about these issues. Things like compliant machine learning, I virtually guarantee other people in this space have not been really thinking about in the way that they need to for GDPR. And lastly, who's doing thought leadership with us doing webinars like this. We also have a website that I'd urge people to go to at www.jumio.com/GDPR that has really great information covering some of the topics that we covered today, but even more information beyond that. And then also we'll be at Money 2020 in Amsterdam. Would love to see people at the booth. But this is really great legislation, really great for consumers, and we look forward to helping more and more people become GDPR enabled and compliant.
Excellent, excellent. And again, I do think that's sort of a nice summary of the conversation. If there's any big takeaway that I take away from this conversation is that idea that this is a big thing. It's coming. It's going to be a paradigm shift for businesses, for individuals, for governments, and that the best way to make sure that you're prepared for it is to get involved with professionals, to get involved with people who have some experience in this space, to make sure that you're doing it the right way the first time. As we mentioned, there are really some monsters at the end of the book, so to speak, for those companies that don't. And there's no reason for companies to find themselves in that position. That there are resources out there, there are people out there, there are organizations out there that are more than equipped to help them make it through, not just make it through actually, but make the best of this new paradigm. So very, very good information. I would like to thank both of our guests, Gemma Rogers, co-founder of Fintrail, and Robert Prigge, who is the Chief Revenue Officer for Jumio, for joining us in what I hope has been a very enlightening conversation on GDPR and online identity proofing for all of you. So thanks again for joining us on the Finovate webinars, and again, we will be having more webinars over the course of the year. Please stay tuned to Finovate.com and to our Twitter feed at Finovate, and we'll have all the information about everything that's up and coming. I do believe, and you can check me on this, that we will have this for people who want to review it and maybe go back and hear some of the insights that Gemma and Robert provided. That will be available on the Finovate.com blog in the days and weeks to come, so go ahead and make sure you keep an eye peeled for that as well. So on behalf of everyone here at Finovate, I want to thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you next time.